As you know, I don't do a ton of interviews. To be honest, I like to keep this light and personal, and I like to break convention. But this man, I really enjoy talking to. I don't know what it is, but I get so inspired by him. I'm lucky to have him as a friend. He is a masterful coach in the areas of emotional intelligence and leadership, and he's recently written a book. It's called The Biology of Leadership, and I'm a little biased, but I think it's something that everyone must read. Please welcome back to the show, my good friend, Carl Oxholm. Hey, Carl, thank you for joining me. How you doing today?
Awesome. It's always great to spend time together. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, likewise. You know, we've been speaking to so many people about your book and about you. And one of the things I hear so often, Carl, is like, you get to talk to Carl every couple of weeks. They're indicating that I'm fortunate to spend this time. And I know I am. And it made me think, how did we start talking? Can you believe it's been 5 years since we first sat down?
5 very quick years, I would say.
And a ton of changes. Now, we had you on several times. You've been on with Sophia, and you and I created a little web series called Identity Talks. So if you haven't heard those episodes or seen those videos, I'm going to put the links in the show notes. But the biggest piece of news is that you've released this great book.
Thank you.
And I want to discuss, first of all, I want to congratulate you on the book itself because it's a wonderful book. But also, I want to talk to you about some of the key concepts because I think this is something that people need to know more about. And I know that it's going to help people who listen to this show. You know I'm a big fan of yours, so of course I'm going to love the book. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that I think we're better served as human beings by not having a giant library of books, but rather to read a few excellent books deeply. So there's certain books that I read every year, and maybe you do too. And I think this book is one of them.
Well,
because
thanks,
I think of course, the practical advice that's contained inside is so powerful. Let me start with a quote from your book. One of your pages asks the question, what kind of leader are you and how do you know? Because that's the $1 million question. So I want to get into that question specifically. But before we do, Carl, tell me about what inspired you to write this book and who it's for and how it helps.
Oh, thanks, Chris. And listen, always such a pleasure to spend time together. So your earlier reference about you and I continuing to connect and stay in touch is an absolute pleasure. And the learning always goes both ways, as your audience can attest to, no doubt. So thank you. It's just, it's a real pleasure to be here with you yet again.
Thanks, Carl.
Yeah, you know, I have to tell you, just years of teaming with brilliant people, having a phenomenal family that I've had the pleasure of spending my days with, my mornings, my noons, my nights, and all of the shared learning that I've had over the years has shown me time and time again, you know, the number of questions that often arise and the consistency of those questions revolving around things like, you know, are you the same person at home that you are in the workplace? You know, it seems to me that you probably are. Are there efficiencies to that? Do you find that effective? And then if I'm giving, you know, a keynote at an organization or providing or facilitating a workshop, often people coming up to me afterwards and saying, so Carl, tell me, like, first of all, do you have a book? And then I would often say, until now, I would say no. And they would say, then can you please provide some suggested readings? And so what I started to find was the convergence of all of these different conversations. So on the home front, I would have my kids who, you know, Scott's now graduated. He's a graduate from university. Haley's just in the midst of her second year of university. And they would often come to me and say, you know, Dad, a lot of our friends, you know, they don't have the regular sit-down dinners, or they didn't have them when they were growing up, where there was an opportunity to not only share whatever was top of mind, but to be able to really learn from one another and with one another in support of each other. Is there any chance that you could capture some of the lessons learned that you've experienced so that we could actually share some of those insights with our friends? And then at the same time, here I was having these senior executives come to me and say, you know, do you have a book, or can you recommend, you know, certain insights from various authors that you think could be highly instructive? And what I started to realize, Chris, through a combination of those worlds, as well as the conversations you and I would have very often, is that of course, there are fantastic authors out there. Of course, there are amazing insights. But what I was finding was there was there was still a need to take a lot of these terrific insights around behavioral neuroscience or evolutionary biology or whatever the case may be, and infuse it through what I would call the business lens. Now, that's where I sort of started in terms of the gap that existed and the opportunity to fill that gap with some stories and insights and pieces of research that I thought would be most relevant. But then at the same time, I had my family members coming to me and saying, but Dad, don't you see that those insights are just as relevant for us on the home front? And so I had my kids starting to explore all the different ways that they were showing up in the world and how they were able to cope with particular challenges that many of their friends were struggling with. And so really, they're the ones who ultimately came to me and said, it's just time. Would you please put these things down so that we can share some of these stories that we love, by the way, but that we struggle to sometimes remember or recall? And can you put them down so that we can share some of that insight with others? And as I started to socialize the idea of that with my friends like you, Chris, and other senior leaders in the marketplace, there seemed to be a real need. And so I was only too happy to make a best attempt, if you will, to fill that need.
And I'm glad you did. It feels like there's a leadership vacuum right now. Would you agree?
Yeah, in fact, what I found in speaking to leaders themselves, and when I say that, I mean, I'll say leaders in quotes, and nobody would be offended by me saying that. Really, what I mean is, so anybody who's in a formal leadership role. So it's very clear that they've been appointed, they have a title, they have so many people who report into them, et cetera. And what I've found in coaching these individuals and mentoring and listening to them and learning from them is that most leaders are actually managing. So they're actually not leading. And even if you just want to take a base case example, if you take some of Harvard's research a number of years ago that suggested that leadership was really about how consciously do you energize those in your care? What about equipping them? What about empowering them? And then as for, do you actually behave in such a way that your actions speak for themselves? As the old adage says, your actions are speaking so loudly, I can't hear a word you're saying. So are you literally living the values that your organization espouses, or are you merely talking about them? And as we started to explore some of these avenues, most of these, again, quote unquote, formal leaders were saying, you know what? I don't even really know where to start in terms of answering that. So, Carl, if I turn that around and say, how do I evidence that I'm energizing the people in my care? Or what specific things or tactics or techniques am I employing to actually equip people to allow their best to shine through and be in service of something that matters to us? Or how do you actually go about empowering individuals, let alone, how conscious am I of being an exemplar myself of the very best of what we suggest we aspire to? And the more they started to really play with this, the more they realized, no, they were actually managing resources. They were trying to find efficiencies with what already existed to some degree, but that was more about filling seats, assessing roles, et cetera. But there was very little effort, conscious effort, if you will, spent, thinking about what is the quality of my energy and how is it that I'm infecting those in my care and that I have the privilege to lead? And am I influencing them in a way that actually moves us in the direction that we say is so critically important to us? So when you say there's a leadership void, that's how I would respond to that. It's less about just my own opinion. And I would say it's more about listening to people in formal leadership roles who have come to the conclusion that they rarely actually lead.
Yeah, that's a good point. Now, I do want to stress one thing. My experience of the book was that this is not just for people who have formal leadership positions. In fact, many times, as you said, people who have the formal recognition of a title often don't know what they're doing, which begs the question once again, what kind of leader are you and how do you know? So I think that this is useful, as you said before, whether you're the leader or a leader in your family, in your community, and or at work with a formal title or not. I think the expectation is that if you can lead better, you have a duty to do so, because if you change one person around you, then that ripple effect starts to touch other people. And so if you don't have the formal title already, it's probably more likely to come to you because the world doesn't need any more bad bosses. So as you become that exemplar that you spoke about, I think you'll notice that it has an effect on your career if you so desire, if you desire to lead in that capacity. So is this the right time to break down the three components of your book, at least at the beginning, which is what is the quality of your energy? What is the focus of your energy? And what's the expression of your energy?
Yeah, no, and again, thanks, Chris, for your very insightful commentary. Let me just back up for a second first before we jump into a bit of the structure of the book and some of the areas that I chose to focus on. Really, at the very beginning of the book, I'm commenting on the fact that leadership ultimately is about influence. And how effectively you influence someone else starts with how effectively you influence yourself. And so, yes, to your point about the fact that, this is not just about leadership in the context of a formal role in the workplace. This is about how do we actually look to optimize the best of who we are in service of not only the moment, but providing the kind of influence that speaks to a win-win. So what do I mean by that? I don't think anybody is interested in you sacrificing yourself for me, nor me sacrificing myself for you. Rather, what kinds of choices can we consciously make, more consciously make from one moment to the next, that seems to bode well for both you and I? And if you use that as a bit of a litmus test, starting with yourself, because at the end of the day, often when I ask people, who do you really control when all is said and done? And they will say themselves. And it's like, exactly. The most effective leaders that I've ever known always start with themselves because you're the only person you actually control. And so if you're facing a misunderstanding or a disconnect of some sort, the greatest leaders pause, step back, and ask themselves, how did I just contribute to that? They become more reflective. They become a student of their own experience, knowing that it's better than just looking out for what's in it for me. There's a more optimal stance, which is, sure, obviously no one wants me to sacrifice myself per se, but what is it that's a win for me and a win for those that I have the opportunity to spend some time with? So I just wanted to back up a second to say that if leadership really is about influence, again, it starts with how effectively you influence yourself. And so that is a nice segue into, the book is really broken into three main areas. The first one delves into elements of our biology that really help shed light on the fact that we physiologically feel before we can think. So when we take in the world through our five senses, those signals travel through our emotional center en route to our thinking center. And so if you don't have your emotions in check, you will be incapacitated to some degree, and therefore you will not be able to access the best of your intellect. Now, the relevance of that is I have yet to meet anybody anywhere that would suggest they're just fine with suboptimal thinking. In other words, you've got all of this training, all of this life experience, all of this wisdom to impart on the moment. But if your emotions are getting the better of you at any given moment or time, then you're simply not going to be able to access the best of that intellect. And so we delve into some of the science around that and some very practical stories that bring that to light that I've heard from many a reader and thrilled to hear from many a reader that they find just so relatable and so practical and therefore so helpful and easy to understand and therefore practice and implement. The second main part of the book is really what jumps into what you're referring to, which is that's fantastic. And it's interesting to understand that. But since the one thing that almost everybody seems to agree to these days is that everything is energy, can you talk a little more about that, Carl, vis-a-vis the kind of influence we have on ourselves and others? And that's where I deconstruct, sure, what is the quality of your energy right now? And then I dive into what we mean around that. What is the focus of your energy? Because even if you've got the quality dialed in, how you actually focus that energy is going to matter. In other words, what you focus on grows. And then ultimately, even if you're dialed in vis-a-vis the quality of your energy, and you've become very attuned to practicing in a way that it plays to the win-win, if we're not expressing ourselves in a way that is resonant with others, where others are really willing to listen and even want to listen, then of course we're going to leave opportunities on the table. And that's when I deconstruct in that sort of part 2 of the book, the quality, the focus, and the expression of your energy. And then the last third of the book really delves into life rewards action. So it's wonderful to understand some of the physiological insights. It's fantastic to bring more awareness to the quality, focus, and expression of our energy. But what are we going to do with this information? Are we actually going to put some things into practice to experiment with the best that we have to offer and then practice being a student of our own experience? In other words, Chris, one of the things I talk about throughout the book is you don't have to believe a word I say, and we don't have to blindly believe any of the research that's being quoted. Rather, I would ask the reader and or the listener, if you're listening to the audiobook, practice being a student of your own experience. In other words, put things into play, some of the ideas, the tactics, the techniques, the suggestions, and see how they work for both you and those in your care. So that's sort of the breakdown of how the book is structured.
This assumes that me, the leader, wants to improve, that I see something in this book that makes me want to say, yeah, you know what? I'd like to be better. I like what you're saying here. How could this book help someone who doesn't know that they're a bad leader? Everyone listening to this right now has had the experience of a leader that is too pushy, that is too aggressive, that is dismissive of others' ideas, that can't control their emotions, many of the things that you just discussed. In your book and in the conversations I've had with you, you frequently mentioned the experience of you. But there are a great many people who probably don't take care to question what that is. So how can this book help people who are dealing with a manager like that? Because you can't just throw the book in their lap and say, hey, do better.
Yeah, no, I love that. Thanks, Chris. And in fact, I do talk about at one point in the book, there's a chapter committed to the idea that, some might suggest this is a lot of what we're talking about is very commonsensical, to which the chapter goes on to say, perhaps, but is it also commonly practiced? And so one of the challenges that I issue in the book, but of course I can do it now for the benefit of your listeners as well, is it's not just about what we think. It's not just about concluding within ourselves that, yeah, I think I'm actually terrific at all of these things. It's learning to look outside of yourself for some evidence. So one of the things I've always done is pause long enough to really ask those that I have the privilege to serve, are we actually creating the kind of shared impact that you were hoping for? If yes, then how so? And if not, then why not? And how do we co-create together in a way that it's always us against the issue, never against each other, and where we're literally producing value? And then the other thing I would often say is that's great. So if you've got clients or customers in the marketplace that you're focused on, let them actually tell you to what degree you're adding value. So ask them, find out from them. Now, I know that doesn't sound earth-shattering, but I would suggest is at the same time, what about the very team members that you have the privilege of working with in service of those clients? So if you listen to the voice of your team members and you listen to the voice of your clients, and perhaps you maybe even layer in listening to the voice of those who are your closest friends and or family members, et cetera, are they helping articulate and evidence for you that indeed the very things that you had hoped to produce vis-a-vis the kind of positive, highly impactful influence that you want to bring to bear, are they corroborating that? And so sometimes, we're very sophisticated as human beings in rationalizing that, yeah, I think that's fair. But what I'm really getting at here is just pause for a second and listen and look around. And if you are not the most sought after boss, confidant, coach, mentor, then just perhaps we're not as effective as we had hoped we could be, or indeed as effective as we might be if we brought a little more focus to this and if we were a little more honest with ourselves. In other words, when you pause and you look around, if it's pretty quiet, then that's likely an indicator that maybe I'm not as effective as I perhaps thought I was. And why do I say that? Because hopefully, if you're very fortunate, or in fact, maybe I'm speaking to someone who does indeed have a track record a mile long of being the most sought after coach, confidant, mentor, boss, role model, you name it. Individuals who actually live the things that I'm talking about in this book, they are so highly in demand that they don't have to pat themselves on the back. There are going to be plenty of other people doing that for them, and they're going to receive that kind of goodwill, that love, that appreciation consistently. And it's not about ego. It's not about, aren't I fantastic in that regard? It's really about, am I optimizing the quality of the influence that I know I could have if I brought a little more of my best to the table, day after day after day. And it's really about, how do we practice? You're never exonerated, meaning it's not like you just all of a sudden arrive and now the rest of your life just unfolds accordingly. That would be like saying, I've been so wonderfully consistent in going to the gym or working out at home, and I'm finally the healthiest I've ever been, so I guess now I never have to exercise again. I mean, that would be silly. So this is about, how do we actually bring the best of who we are to bear in service of this moment, from one moment to the next? And then how do we use any form of external indicators to really help validate and evidence that indeed you are producing the kind of value that you had hoped? So again, just to summarize, the good news for your listeners, Chris, who think that this is both commonsensical and they commonly practice it, well, first of all, congratulations and wonderful. Second of all, know that still stay conscious, because you can't just rest on that. This is a dynamic process. But thirdly, recognize that your track record will be a mile long. And so be honest about that. If you're not in demand in that regard, then there are very likely opportunities to improve accordingly.
That's a great summary. Here's something I know you struggle with, which is, in a corporation, if there's no appreciation for these qualities in this kind of leader, then it's not being reinforced, in the sense that nobody's intentional about spreading these qualities. You talk about intention a lot in your book. It stands to reason that part of the challenge of spreading the message in this book to a large-scale organization and beyond is the will at the top to say, yes, this is important. Yes, we will encourage it and measure it and support it and create the safety, so that if I needed to, I could go to you, Carl, and say, you know what, Carl, the way that you lead sometimes is a little bit outside my boundaries. It doesn't work for me. It doesn't motivate me. It demotivates me. Are you open to some feedback on that? Can I help you become better? But if that's not supported all the way up and down the organization, we're going to have a problem. And organizations tend to focus on what easily translates to shareholder value. I know that's been one of the challenges on your quest in bringing Virtue Compass to life. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's so interesting. So many, again, of your audience members will have heard of something referenced as the golden rule, which effectively is to treat others the way you'd like to be treated. Well, that's fantastic if you actually know you're surrounded by people who are loving, they like you, they respect you, you're all on the same page, you understand that together you're better, etc. But that's not always a given. And so there's something instead called the platinum rule when it comes to business. Well, and before I even jump into what is the platinum rule, so let me step back. If you don't have that kind of environment around you, where you already know that it's safe, to your point, there's deep connection, there's tremendous mutual respect, what if instead you're working with someone who's particularly edgy, or to your point, they have an approach that really does not resonate with your own? Then, of course, for them to treat you the way they want to be treated might be a recipe for disaster, at least in your own mind. And that's why, again, you had some of the in the world of academia, they came up with something called the platinum rule. But again, you don't have to blindly believe anything. Put these things into practice and see for yourself if it's more versus less effective. And the platinum rule says, do unto others as you perceive they need done unto themselves. In other words, it's not about practicing leading everybody else the way you want to be treated necessarily. It's about getting to know the people that you have the privilege to lead, and to know them as individuals, not just to know about them, what is their degree, what role are they in, but actually know them as individuals. What do they aspire to? What are their greatest strengths? Where would they like to see themselves in 3 years' time? What kinds of things are getting in the way? How can you help them remove some obstacles, etc.? As the old adage goes, when you choose the behavior, you choose the consequence, but also recognizing that, you want to positively reinforce those behaviors that you want to see more of. So when you get to know somebody for the magic of who they are, when you help them understand the relevance of their role and why it's so important to the greater good within the organization and the clients we service, and then you help lead them and energize them and equip them and empower them in a way that actually helps them bring their best to the table. In other words, you practice being highly adept at adapting. Again, it's not the strongest that survive, as the misnomer used to suggest. It's the most adaptive. So to your point, I would say to the leaders that are listening, if you're in a formal leadership role, and of course, everybody to the degree that we're talking about our own, how effectively we influence ourselves and thereby lead ourselves, it's really more about how is it, first of all, am I bringing the best of who I am to the table? And then to what end? Am I actually affecting or positively infecting someone else to the degree that it gives them permission, or at least they perceive they now have the permission to bring the best of who they are in service of the moment? And if all I'm doing, I heard someone referring the other day to the importance of a meritocracy, which is being merit-oriented vis-a-vis when you say this is what matters to us organizationally, and you really look to measure the kinds of indicators that are going to be aligned with those kinds of behaviors. Is it actually a meritocracy that you find yourself within, or is it more of a mirrortocracy? In other words, a situation or environment where people are simply hiring and promoting people who look and sound a lot like them. And so just being mindful of some of these things can be very important. You asked, is it going to change anything if you find yourself reporting into someone who doesn't seem to understand your strengths, appreciate your strengths, et cetera? But you see, Chris, this is why it comes full circle to what I talked about earlier. If the people that you have the privilege to team with and the clients that team, along with you, have the privilege to serve, if the team and the clients are all thrilled, yes, there's always going to be feedback, there's things we can improve, et cetera, but they really do enjoy the experience that you co-create with them, and they really do want to see you again, and they really would be happy to refer you, and you really are someone that they want to have as a coach and a continuing mentor, et cetera, then life is effectively showing you that indeed you are adept at adapting. You are effectively addressing their unique needs, and whether it's the client or the team members, and thereby that's what's having them wanting you to be around more consistently in the near, mid, and long term. So I've said a lot there, but my point is, if you're not experiencing that, if you don't have the team members wanting to spend more time with you, if you don't have the clients wanting to call you beyond just the question of the day, but rather maybe they want to explore broader things and they just enjoy the nature of the relationship they have with you, then there are opportunities being left on the table.
One thing that you would probably never brag about or admit even publicly, but you and I have spoken about a couple of times, is that when you are this kind of leader, you all of a sudden, as you described, find people flocking to you because you're authentic, because they trust you, because you display an interest and an intention to honor them and their interests, their passions, their motivations, their goals and objectives. And I would think at some point, and I know this happened to you, you have other people who are starting to go, wait a second, I'm one of those leaders who's all push, 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 very aggressive, very A-type personalities. They take pride on being rigid and impenetrable. And yet they must look at a guy like you and say, why does everyone go to Carl for advice instead of me? I'm your boss. I'm your leader. You're in my department. How come everyone is migrating to these kinds of leaders? And the other thing is that this behavior generates results. One of the things you've experienced and I've experienced is that people say, well, all this soft stuff is great, Carl, but it doesn't show up on the dashboards and the scorecards. Yes, it does. You led one of the most successful units in your company, the company that you retired from. And yes, that's partly due to your talent in the discipline, but it's largely attributable to the fact that everyone loves the kind of leader that Carl is. Is that true?
I can't say that I'm sure that's true, but I'll leave that to the voices of the Chris's of the world and others that I've had the privilege to team with. I would love to aspire to that having be true. I want to bring a level of consciousness to my intention to give the best I can to help ensure that that is true. But again, that's going to be in the eye of the beholder. What I can tell you is you're touching on something I think is profound, and that's why the title of my book was The Biology of Leadership. You know, when Google did its highly intensive data-based research piece around high-performing teams called Project Aristotle, and they wanted to better understand what are the core attributes necessary for team members to perform at their best, and therefore the team as a whole to produce something that is greater than the sum of its parts. And the one attribute more than any other that the research distilled down to as being a bit of the aha is what you've alluded to earlier, and you just did again, and that is psychological safety. So the bottom line is this. The reason I referred to the biology of leadership is very simply because physiologically speaking, we react the same way to a perceived threat as we do an actual physical threat. In other words, when you face a physical threat, cortisol, which is your primary stress hormone, floods your supercomputer, if you will, your cortical brain, and all the blood and adrenaline rushes to the big muscles in your body because you're getting ready to fight or flee. Well, back in the day, that was wonderful because when you were literally hunting and gathering and you saw the saber-toothed tiger, yes, it's no time to debate. So you either fight the tiger or you run away from it. But here's the beauty. When you are physically active, the cortisol starts to dissipate, which allows your emotional and thinking center to realign again, re-engage, and now you can think clearly again. Now, fast forward to the boardroom. If somebody in the boardroom, or even within your own family dynamic at the dinner table, if somebody says something towards you that you perceive as a threat to your ego, a threat to your title, a threat to your bonus, you name it. We're limited only by our imagination. That perception is going to have the same physiological consequence as it would facing a physical threat. So here's the kicker. We know that we become incapacitated. So tell me, back to your earlier descriptor, for a leader, someone who has formal authority and the opportunity to influence others and to hopefully create a positive multiplier effect, although of course, if they're not conscious of the things we're talking about, they can just as easily create a toxic multiplier effect. So imagine somebody who comes into the room and does the exact opposite of creating a psychologically safe space, i.e., I'm not sure I physically feel safe, or maybe I don't emotionally feel safe, or I certainly don't feel psychologically safe in their presence. In other words, I don't feel like I can just share the truth of what I'm observing in the moment for fear of fill in the blank. If that's somebody who you are accustomed to spending time to, and that individual happens to be your formal leader. In other words, at the 11th hour, this person makes a habit of incapacitating the very person that they needed to have at their best, particularly when they needed the most. That is no leader. And the reason why I wanted to call it the biology of leadership is because biology is foundational to all of us. This is not about philosophical differences of opinion or even from a psychological or a introversion, extroversion, or all of these different things that we hear about, all fantastic, by the way, all wonderfully important. But the biological core tenet, the foundation, is basically consistent amongst all of us. Let's call it common humanity, if you will. So this is not about, are you an introvert, an ambivert, an extrovert, et cetera. This is about, are you human? And if you're human, then the things that I'm talking about apply to you. And so the neuroscience continues to evolve. And the more and more and more I started to research these things and work with experts in the field, et cetera, the more I realized that, you know what, Chris, people who are in formal positions of authority who think they can lead the way they used to, which is more of the command and control orientation, pretending they have all the answers, they have yet to make their first mistake. If you're not willing to do this, I'll find somebody who will. And of course, the expressions go on at length. If that's the kind of individual you've practiced into becoming, well, I have news for you. You're simply not going to be the type of individual who can create a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. You will never understand what synergy actually consists of. Because, 1 + 1 really can equal 3 or 5 or 7, but it can also equal -10. And so for me, it became more about how do I share these key insights such that we can no longer excuse ourselves when we just finished saying something in a way that clearly incapacitated those in our care. Now, it's one thing for me to bring everybody's attention to this. It would be another thing for me to say one thing but do another. So I am very mindful of the fact, and I practice from moment to moment to moment, doing the very best I can to live the very things that I'm talking about. And if the consequence of that aligns with what you so kindly pointed out, which is people want to continue to talk to me or collaborate with me or cooperate with me or have me co-create together in a way that moves us forward, well, then how wonderful is that? And I will say this one last thing on this point. I actually don't think there's anybody that doesn't truly want that on some level. It's just remember that practice makes progress. And so, but progress with regards to what? Well, we're talking about progressing towards being that much more effective vis-a-vis the quality of the positive influence we're having on others. But you can be just as practiced at misery if that's your choice. I'm trying to bring more intention to this so we can be more mindful of what is it that you want to practice. Do you want to be a compassionate, loving leader that by definition almost, by default almost with enough practice, creates the kind of psychologically safe space that has everybody offering their best, or some alternative that's suboptimal? And ultimately, I think that's the question we can ask one another. There's a lot of information in the book that can speak to that to hopefully help you along the way. And I think there are any number of candid litmus tests that we can check in with to see and to measure the kind of progress we're actually having.
There's so much to unpack there, Carl, but there's something important that I caught that I definitely want to mention. I think that if you want to have, I won't say an easy life, but a peaceful life as a leader, you can't spend all of your time worrying about the things and the people that you can't control. What you can do is if there's an inkling that you want to be the kind of leader that you're describing, whether it's the ability to grow and expand and enhance your career, to grow and expand and enhance yourself, to grow and expand and enhance your influence, whichever of these topics we've been speaking about today motivates you, grabs you, and says, yeah, I want some of that. You will always encounter people who don't agree and who don't do the same. You have great stories, and I'll get back to stories in a minute, but you have a great story about a boardroom situation where someone very, very high ranking says, I think we should do this. What are your ideas? And you couldn't help but notice how going first with the ideas robbed everyone else in the room with the freedom to truly contribute and to truly say, here's what I think. I'd love to bring my ideas to the table, to feel valued, to feel like you're contributing, which really are big determinants of success and happiness in your daily work and life. Bringing all that back to a point, if you're reading this book or hearing us talk about it on the podcast and you say, this is great, but I don't think this is going to work for me. The only person it has to work for is you. Because then if you just worry about controlling what you can control and developing the only leader that you can influence to start with, which is you, that the influence to the larger parts of the organization will probably come naturally as a byproduct of enhancing your practice, taking right action, and focusing on being better. Did I capture that well? Does that kind of describe your thoughts on it as well?
Yeah, I love it. It's kind of like put on your lab coat, right? This is your experiment. And you really are a unique original. You're a one-of-a-kind expression of life itself. And so it's less about being told this, that, or the other. And it's really just about sharing some insights and some science through storytelling and otherwise to really help us self-reflect and perhaps give us some tools to even look through and to test and to see if I put this into play and I practice accordingly, what do I discover? And that's why I love the expression being a student of your own experience. You can see for yourself. It's not about blindly believing Chris, Carl, or anybody else for that matter. It's about sharing some insights that have proven themselves very, very helpful for many and just allowing yourself the opportunity to self-reflect. And here's what I found, Chris. Either you read it and there's any number of insights that you find novel or and interesting, intriguing, maybe even just things that you had forgotten about. And so you put them into practice. And those who are doing that are finding, wow, this has really been profound. It's been helpful, et cetera. Or at the very minimum, you would be reminded of some of the reasons why the very approach you're taking is working so effectively. I've had some people say, I have had a lot of success already in this space or another. I just didn't really know why that was the case. And so when I either read the story that I related to, or I looked at the science, or I understood the explanation, or I looked at the tool and saw that was a way of helping create almost more of a structure for me to better understand that if I keep doing it this way, this is why I was getting those kinds of results, then any number of those things have proven very helpful for people. And that was the point. There's a funny adage that I've often heard, which is, all tools are wrong, but some can be helpful. And the reason I always found that so funny is it's really just pointing out that there is no tool or technique that's going to be the be all end all for everyone all the time, everywhere. It's really just more about, are we sharing some of the things that we know have worked really effectively for a broad cross-section of individuals from many different backgrounds? And when the answer consistently comes back yes and yes and yes again, just maybe it would be worthwhile to share. And that's why I'm really so grateful to Scott and Haley, and of course Julie as my lifelong coach and mentor and incredible wife. But I would say as a family, they just continuously came back to me and said, Dad, can you remind me about this? Or can you remind me about that? And of course, I would do in kind with my parents, with my family, and with my friends. And so this is just about distilling some of those insights that, who knows, just might be helpful. And if indeed any number of these insights are helpful, well, then it was all worthwhile, wasn't it?
I agree with you. Now, while the book is very practical, one of the things that I have the privilege of knowing about you is that you're a great storyteller. You have a great way of relating things and sharing your experiences. So when you get your hooks into this book, you're going to hear some of those stories. And I highly recommend, if you're going to take the study of this topic, the biology of leadership, seriously, you should get the audiobook. Because as you can hear from this podcast, Carl is I won't say character, but Carl is he's got an energy. A big component of that energy is the way he relates the truth of what he knows and what he feels through those stories. So do yourself a favor and grab the audiobook, because you get to hear Carl the way the rest of the world experiences him when you are doing live coaching or webinars or events. But I want to ask you, Carl, if you could, I hate to put you on the spot, but is there one or a small number of stories that really stand out to you that you knew had to be in this book?
Well, I'm really, really, really happy to say, and thank you again, Chris, for, as always, your kindness and your friendship and your support. I would say the really neat thing is there were many, many more stories that didn't get into the book. And so my short answer is the ones that landed in the book are the ones that were all relevant. The neat thing was I was able to use other fantastic individuals that I had the pleasure of now calling friends, that I got to know through the process of writing the book and doing the audio version with my publishing company, with Page Two, the publication company. They were so fantastic, my copy editor and the structural editor, that they were there to say, you know what, Carl, I mean, how can we talk about, the biology of leadership and leave out this story or this, so for example, when I talk about one of the wonderful conversations I had with a Olympic gold medalist, I won't go into all the details of the story, but, here she was confiding in me, sharing a story about how she was so focused on the end that as a result of that, she actually couldn't recall what the journey was like, only to find that when it culminated in the gold medal and in becoming world champion, the best there is on the planet, how is it possible that after all of that, she sat in a cafe with her mom and looked at her in tears, only to conclude, why am I no different? And so I won't go into more detail there other than to say, to read the depth of that story and what she took away from that and how it informed how she wanted to then move forward accordingly, so that the experience of her became her primary focus as opposed to the story about her. And why is that so relevant in today's day and age? Well, all you have to do is pick up any of the latest research around social media and the fact that we are spending more time watching other people live their life as opposed to actually experience what it is to live our own, and then to observe the kind of experience that we get to now co-create with those in our presence. There are consequences to that. And so when you hear somebody at the highest level of fame and fortune, give yet another example of how come when I actually got there, this so-called, different person that I was supposed to be did not make themselves manifest. And what did I learn about that? I mean, I don't know how you keep a story like that and not share it. But of course, there are many other stories about lessons I learned from my parents, from my family, from CEOs all around the world that I think a lot of listeners and readers have told me, Chris, they found fascinating because it's kind of like being the proverbial fly on the wall. You get to sit in on the conversations I had with these global leaders. And in many instances, you get to play along. Because when I'm telling the stories, I'm sharing very candidly, here's what this CEO said to me. This was my question in response. And what I found a lot of readers have done and listeners, if they've either paused the audio or they've paused when they're reading it and they kind of close the book and they just imagine if that was me in that situation, if I was Carl in that situation and that CEO just challenged me the way they challenged Carl, what would I do or say? So I'm finding any number of individuals are also finding that's been really, really instructive and fun, entertaining, but also very informative along the way. And I will tell you that so much of that has come from storytelling. And maybe the last one I would just say, because someone was kind enough to share with me last night the impact this had on them. One of my stories, I talk about the receptionist who worked at the front desk of a very well-known organization, and how she was defining herself by her role, but rather than seeing the joy that she was bringing to people on a regular basis and the fact that she's the first face that everybody sees and thereby has this tremendous opportunity unique unto herself, she was playing the comparison game. And she was comparing her role and her responsibilities with some of those around her. And let's just say it didn't bode well for her self-esteem, for how she was showing up, for what she thought about herself. And she approached me and wanted to know if there were any insights that I could share or things that she could practice that might inform otherwise. And so we had a lot of fun exploring some tools and techniques that really made all the difference in the world. And I'll leave it to the book and the audio to hear in her own words, what it was that she decided to do and the kind of impact that it produced. But yeah, I would say honestly, Chris, all of the stories were relevant. The publisher and the editor made sure that it didn't make its way into the book if it didn't speak to the title. And so I was thrilled to have a very discerning audience keep me on point, keep me focused. And so I hope the product of that is something that's going to be very meaningful from the very first page straight through to the end. But even if you can just find one takeaway, honestly, I'd be thrilled with that.
And that should be easy enough to do just because of the volume of material. And like you say, credit to the editors for being able to congeal it and make it tuneful and make it something that you can consume and keeps you turning the pages. But I will mention something that you touched on, that it's not just the stories, because you're a man who has a very, very complete toolkit of solutions to problems and suggestions and ideas that could help a leader no matter what state they're in. And that's what makes the book so enjoyable and conversing with you so enjoyable. But one of the things that's really, really rare, that if you get nothing out of this book, it's worth 100 times the cover price, just observing you asking really good questions. That's something that not everyone might guess when you look at a book like this that you would get. But if you just read the stories and see how after observing something for a moment and asking curious questions, you have that really big question that turns the conversation around. It tends to be the one that's like a moment, an inciting moment that in any great story makes someone go, whoa, 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 what just happened? And it's those questions that open the door to transformation Because when they give the answers, they have to admit something. They have to surrender something. They have to be vulnerable, even if just for a moment. And when that happens, you have the opportunity as a coach, which you are, to transform.
I was just going to say, Chris, can I tell you what I love so much about that is, and again, I've heard this from you, and I've heard this from others who were kind enough to share their thoughts. The questions, when you hear Chris frame that, you might be thinking it's questions of others. And I even alluded to that earlier, and how many have found that entertaining and fun to experience. But really, all of the questions can also start with just asking them of yourself. And what I love about that is I treat my own book as a reminder for myself to look through and sit with those questions and self-reflect on how do I answer them with regards to myself before I even jump into how curious I am about how others around me may speak to them. So I really, really love that was one of your key takeaways and your key observations. I'm grateful to you for mentioning that. Thank you.
Of course, and it was a ton of fun to just read it and experience it. So I'm going to ask you two last questions. The first one is, what is your hope for people by writing this book? What do you hope that they get out of it? What do you hope it does for a handful of people or a handful of companies or the whole world? The second question, I'll just throw them both together.
Sure.
You can answer them at once.
Sure.
Where can they get the book, number one? Where can they then, if they want more of your help, where can people find you?
Thank you, sir. So on the first one, here's what I would say. I would say that really all of it, everything that's been shared there, if you reach out to me personally, I'd be happy to carry on the conversation. What did I want? I wanted to continue to stimulate a conversation in this area. And so this book is really, hopefully, a catalyst for that. What else would I love to see? Many things. I would love to see you trusting being a student of your own experience. I would love to see you trusting your own intuition, the derivation of the word being inner teacher. Ultimately, I'd love to see people give themselves permission to be who they are. And what I'm noticing time and time again is how often that isn't the case, where we are showing up pretending to be someone or something we're not. And in truth, when I see people give themselves permission to literally just harness the wisdom that is true to their own experience, regardless of the journey, labeling aside, how can I show up in this moment, contribute the best of who I am and what I know in service of this moment? That's it. Will you give yourself permission to do so? And because I've encountered so many people that struggle to do that, my hope is there are any number of avenues throughout this book that can make that more readily accessible, if you will. And that would be my greatest hope. Because if I can, you said earlier at the very outset, you talked about authenticity and trust in the same sentence. And what I always love to point out is just recognize, everybody, those two things are not mutually exclusive. When you are authentic to who you are, you're giving me the greatest opportunity to trust you. To put another way, if you're pretending to be someone or something you're not, how in the world do you think I'm going to trust you accordingly? So these things go hand in hand. They are not separate and apart from. And then as a derivation of that, I would just say, I talk in the book at one point, if you're going to practice anything, it's practicing being the source of what you seek. So very often we're constantly, I hear people often say, well, when my parents start, behaving this way, then maybe I'll behave that way. Or when my leader behaves this way, then maybe I'll behave that way. And it's like, you know what? What if instead you practiced being the source of what you seek? If you want someone in your care or in your company to listen more carefully to what you have to say, practice instead first becoming an amazing listener yourself. How can you do that? Practice asking the questions. Because there's no greater gift than to genuinely listen to someone. And when you ask somebody else a question, they presuppose you care about their answer. Moreover, they presuppose you care about them. And that's a really nice foundation for a fantastic relationship. Put another way, if you would love for somebody in your midst to find you fascinating, why don't you first practice finding out what it is about them that you can be fascinated about? So again, practicing being the source of what you seek, by virtue of giving yourself permission to be the very essence of who you are and then contributing accordingly. Yes, in service of this moment in a way that serves the win-win, right? Not just you and not just them, but for both of you in kind. And as for how can people get in touch with me, honestly, I would just say, the easiest is go to my website at www.virtuecompass.com, VIRTUE, compass, so all connected, all lowercase, .com. And in there, not only can you see a little bit more about my own approach to what it is that I'm doing, but there's plenty of information there about the book. There's also links to buy it on Amazon. By the way, you can buy it on any of your favorite retailers. So Amazon, anywhere in the world, Indigo, Chapters, Barnes and Noble, etc. If you're an Audible fan or an audiobook fan, then again, any of your favorite sources, Spotify, iTunes, Audible, etc. They all carry the book. And I would just welcome you. Within the website, there's a tab called Testimonials. And all these wonderful people, present company included with Chris, have provided some very in-depth insights about why they found the book so particularly valuable. And not only do the comments warm my heart, but I find them really, really informative. And the other thing I love about them is they're so different. People find so many different reasons as to why the book resonated with them and why they're willing to recommend it. And so if you're not sure about if this is something you want to read or not, maybe I can just suggest going there, have a read of any number of the testimonials. And then obviously, if you decide to honor me accordingly, well, thank you very much. And also thank you for your time today. And naturally, of course, it goes without saying, Chris, but thank you for your never-ending time, friendship, and support.
Oh, you're most welcome. And thank you for putting this book out into the world. You mentioned something a minute ago, which is everyone seems to get something different out of it. I think that's what great books do, because when you first encounter a text, if it's transformative, only 10% of it will make sense. And you might not even retain or remember all of that 10% if you don't put it into action faithfully. But what happens is the next time you read it, if you've grown, it will reveal something different to you, which is why I don't recommend a lot of books, because very few books do that. And you managed to do it very well. Carl, I'm grateful for you. I'm proud of you for making this book, because it's a wrestle. If anyone's ever tried to write a book before, it's not easy. And I want to thank you for the gift of putting it into the world, because whether you help 5 people with this or 5 million people with this, the contribution is exactly the same. And I hope that those of you listening will grab a copy and take it seriously and really dig into the material, because it can change you as a leader. And finally, I'll say, because it's important to say stuff like this while we're both still standing, is that if I didn't have your friendship, if I didn't have our regular calls every so often, the world would be a less bright place. So when I say thank you, I really mean thank you. Carl, it was wonderful to have you on the show.
Well, listen, Chris, thank you yet again. And to everybody who's listening right now, thank you. And I really celebrate you. And by all means, feel free to reach out to me. LinkedIn is probably the easiest, but even through my website, you can find my email. And I'd love to carry on the conversation. Thanks, everybody.
And I'll put all of those links in the show notes. So one more time, thank you, Carl Oxholm, for joining us today. Guys, go check out The Biology of Leadership.
Couldn't you just listen to that guy all day? Me too. Look, do us a favor. Give this book a chance. Put it in your library. Check it out. Let us know what you think. I've got all of his information and details down below to make it easy for you to find him and to grab the book. Thank you, as always, for supporting me and supporting my network of trusted professionals like Carl Oxholm. I appreciate you listening today. I look forward to seeing you next time, and until then, stay badass.